So today we have. So we're starting with the character of Sarah, and again, Sarah is a very common character. We all know about her. So today, as we go look at the story of Sarah and her significance in our biblical history, we'll be looking at some of the common stories that we know of Sarah, but also some of the unless you've read Genesis chapter 12 to 23, which is covers the story of the life of Sarah. There's some unknown or lesser known stories of Sarah that I think are interesting as we look at the character of who she was. And so again, this course is about looking at the stories of these women that have made a significant impact on our Judeo-Christian heritage, and kind of gleaming from their lives lessons to learn. So first of all, who is Sarah? We all know Sarah, right? We all know her as the wife of Abraham. She's actually one of two women that are listed in the book of Hebrews. Now, the book of Hebrews is in the New Testament, and Hebrews chapter 11 has a list of folks that the writer of Hebrew deemed as throughout Jewish history, those who have exemplified people of strong faith. And of course, you have Abraham and some of the other patriarchs of the Jewish faith, but there's only two women that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. That chapter is known as chapter of faith, and Sarah's one of them. But we're going to see in her life, some of the challenges that she really had in terms of really exemplifying that faith. Of course, she is the wife of Abraham, but did you also know that she's actually his sister? So I know, and this actually comes into play, and we'll actually see one of the stories. And again, back in those days, you're talking to not 2,000, 4,000 years ago. The dating of Abraham and Sarah is around 2000 BC. And so you're talking, what, 4,000 years ago. Back in those days, people married you guys all married your cousins and your brothers and sisters. It was just a common thing, right? So Abraham's father is Terah, and Terah, tradition says that Sarah was one of the daughters of Terah through a different mother. And so Sarah was Abraham's sister. Now, the name of Sarah, you all know the story. Originally, Abraham's name was Abram, and Sarah's name was Sarai. And the name Sarai actually means my princess. If you think if that was a name given to Sarai by her father Terah, then it was to say that this is my princess. And when Abram married Sarai, her name was my princess. But in Genesis chapter 17, when God calls upon Abram and Sarah and gives them the covenant to become his chosen people, and that through them they would have the covenant was given to them, where they would have children as many as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, and make that covenant with them. God changed their names. From Abram went to Abraham, and from Sarai it went to Sarah. And Sarah, basically, it's a very small change in the definition, means the princess. And so from just being my personal princess, she becomes the princess. In other words, she becomes the princess for all the nations, or the mother of all nations. Moving on, if I can click on this. So in Genesis chapter 12, which is the starting point of the story of Abraham and Sarah, they lived in a town or city, a place called Ur, in that region of the Chaldeans. And so that is where we would say, where is that right now? Is that Iraq?
Iraq,
right? Ish. So that's where they started from. That was their home. and then they moved to Haran. So Terah, the father, so Abraham's father, took Abram, Sarai, and Abram's nephew Lot, the three of them, and they moved to Haran just as a way of moving to. The Bible doesn't say why he moved. It just says that Terah took Abram and Sarai and Lot and moved from to Haran. In Haran, the father Terah dies, and at that point, Abram and Sarai decides to move south and to Canaan. And the reason for that is, of course, they receive a calling from God, and the promise was that God is leading them to a new life, and that new life is going to be in this place, this land of Canaan, where it is going to be a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was supposed to be this prosperity. The fact that they moved from to Haran in the first place meant that Terah, Abram, Sarai, they were willing to leave their homeland. And back in those days, people didn't move around that much, right? People usually settled in one place, lived in one place. It was their home. If they moved, that means they were nomads. And so already they had the sense of leaving, that there was no permanence in their life already. So they left their homeland and were willing to follow God to wherever God led them. And they were following this promise that God would be leading them to a land flowing with milk and honey. So let's look at some of the common stories of Sarah that we know. So again, here, oh, by the way, when they leave, the Bible says that Abram was 75 years old. Sarah is about 10 years younger. So she's about 65. So in a way, you could think of it as, maybe, their retirement age, from Haran to Canaan, they're going south for the winter, or it's like moving to Florida, right? If you lived in the northern parts of the United States. So they're going to warmer land, I don't know. But they're at retirement age, and their age is very important because you have to kind of ask yourself, wow, at that age, would I be picking up my stuff and just going to somewhere that's completely foreign? So the two common stories of Sarah that we know of, the first one is probably the story of Sarah and Abraham, the challenge that they had of conceiving a child. So again, when they left, when they went to Canaan, Abraham was already 75 years old. Sarah was about 65. And again, their name should be Abram and Sarai. And they went to Canaan looking for a new life, or to establish a new home. And part of the promise, the covenant that God gave them, was that they would not only go to a land that's flowing with milk and honey, but the big promise was the descendants, that they would be the parent, the mother and father of many, many descendants, that they would have many children. Well, it took them a while to have children. And in Genesis 16, already 10 years have gone by. That means Abraham is 86, Sarah is now 75, and Sarah gets impatient. And so in Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, it tells the story. So that's one of the stories. We're actually going to read the story in the next slide. The other story that we commonly know of Abraham and Sarah is, of course, when Sarah does become pregnant and conceive a son, and that's in chapter 18. So let's look at the story in chapter 16. So it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife. He went into Hagar and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she, Sarai, looked with contempt on her mistress. Right. So this is actually an interesting story. You know, when Grace and I first got married, I don't know if I ever told the story. Grace had, she already had it all planned out. How many kids we're gonna have, how many, you know, what their names are. She even had it planned out what the gender of each child was gonna be. She knew that, she had it planned out that, well, so she wanted 5 children, okay? She wanted 5 children. The first one was going to be a boy. The second one was going to be a girl. The third one was going to be another boy, and then another boy, and then a girl. And she had the names for all 5 of them all picked out when we first got married. We got married fairly early. I was 25. Grace was just 22. And we had hoped that, you know, about within a year, we'll start having.
Listen to him.
What was that? Oh, sorry. So that was the plan. But, you know, I at that time I was doing youth ministry, and you know, and growing up, our parents told us, you know, her father made sure that when I first took Grace out on a date, that I had her home by 8 o'clock. You know all that, right? Well, when we first got married, we tried to have children. Guess what? It took us 6 years. It took us 6 years to have our first child, Nathaniel, and by the time he was born, we realized, okay, if it takes 6 years to have one child, how long is it going to take us to have 5 children? It was going to take us 30 years, and our plan all changed. Of course, you know, the lesson that we learned was you can't plan any of this. Well, here is a story of Sarah. The promise that, you know, she knew that she had this promise from God that she will have children, but she couldn't wait. And okay, you know, who can blame her, right? It's been 10 years since that promise. She's already 85 years old, and she takes matters into her own hands. And so she conceives this plan to take her slave, her servant, Hagar, and tells Abram, you know, you're going to take my servant girl, Hagar, take her as your second wife, and you'll conceive a child through her, and then I will adopt that child to be our child. It was her plan. And through all this, Abraham's reaction is, sure, why not, right? And so he just goes along with it. But what happens after Hagar conceives? What does it say? She immediately has contempt. And I love this picture. It's actually, do you see the picture of Sarai in the back, Sarah in the back, right? How does she look? Is she happy? This was her plan, right? This is her plan. There's Hagar. Hagar has the child. Abraham's there going, oh, look at this little adorable child. And you see Sarah in the back realizing, okay, this was her plan, and yet she's not happy at all. And that becomes a stone, a grudge within her. She immediately has contempt, not only for Hagar, but also for Abram. She starts blaming Abram for everything. And you kind of have to imagine the type of marital relationship that they had moving forward after that. This passage, shines a lesson on, I don't know what you could say, impatience. Sometimes when we don't wait for God's promise to come about, we start taking matters into our own, and sometimes it doesn't always work out the way we planned. And so again, Sarai tries to force God's promise, tries to force God's hand by creating her own timeline. She engineered this and what she thought was going to be the best outcome, but it ultimately ends up being something that damages their relationship. So that's one of the stories that we know of, okay? And so her reaction after that is contempt. The second story, the common story that we know of, okay, is in chapter 18. And so kind of fast forwarding the timeline a bit. By the time Abraham is about 99 years old, So you're talking many years have gone by, right? About 14 years later. In Genesis chapter 18, there are these messengers, three men that visit Abraham and Sarah. And in that exchange, these three men come about, and the story is here. I'll read it for you in Genesis chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. As he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I found favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, kneaded, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took a curd and yada yada. There's this incredible hospitality. There's this sense of the Middle Eastern culture has this. Let me take a little side story. In 2019, before the pandemic, I had the opportunity to go and visit Jerusalem. It was the first time going to Jerusalem, and I went with a group of clergy, and like many of the trips to Israel, I was part of a group of a tour group. And during the day, we would go out and, you have these scheduled visits to the various sites. And then in the evening, we would come back, and after a huge dinner, we had the evening off. And in the evening, I would go off by myself and wander through the streets of Old Jerusalem, because that's the only way you can really visit a new place, right? And so I would go to the streets of Jerusalem, and they were really small. I mean, the streets are narrow. How many of you have been to Jerusalem before? So I know Bill has, of course. Some couple of hands. Chris probably went with Bill.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So the streets, as you know, the streets are very narrow, and they're stairs up, stairs down, and all throughout. And I was just wandering through, and as I was wandering through, just kind of looking around, all of a sudden, I realized I ended up just walking through a door and into some other door, and I was standing in the dining room of someone's home. Because they're all just like corridors here and there, and they're just walking into someone's house, and I am just standing there, and they were just seated there, having dinner. And I thought, at first I kind of thought, oh my gosh, I just intruded on someone's house without, and I apologized, about to leave. But do you know what their reaction was? Bill, you know what
Oh yeah, come on in.
Exactly. They're just like, "Oh, just welcome, come. Do you want to have dinner?" They just want, they sat me down. They wanted me to have dinner with them. It was just this, I just walked in on people's homes, and their hospitality was just come join us. A total stranger. That was just an amazing experience. Well, that's the type of hospitality that the culture, Middle Eastern culture, actually has. And I kind of see that in this Bible passage. These 3 visitors come by, they don't have corridors there, but of course in the desert. And Abraham just goes out of his way to serve them. And then of course, after that, verse 9 continues. They said to Abraham, or Abram at that time, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" Or actually, Abraham and Sarah. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the
When
tent.
you had asked me to take a look at your arm, you
Yeah.
can get an idea.
Sorry, Nancy, I can't mute you. I don't have that power.
I'm not working anymore. That's going on.
So in due season, your wife Sarah will have a son, and Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham were old, advanced in years. It has ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed at herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?
Everywhere haven't
Will I indeed bear a child now that I am old?
really tight.
Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it. "I did not laugh.
Freezing.
He
Are you
said,
cold?
"Yes, you did laugh."
Oh, my goodness.
And so
Everywhere else.
that's the other common story that we know of Abraham and Sarah, right? That encounter where the messengers of God come and they said to Abraham has this hospitable welcome to them, and they are given a promise, a second part of their promise, which is the fact that they are going to promise a son. And there Sarah laughs at that, thinking, "There's no way. Abraham is 99 years old. Sarah, it must be 89 years old. Can you imagine having a child at that age?" Right? No, right? That's impossible. You know, you know that my boys are all grown now and they're big. And not long ago I said to Grace, I really miss those days when Nathaniel and Daniel were really young, because I really loved those days when I got to cuddle with them, I got to wrestle with them, I got to like really just have a lot of fun with them. And you know what Grace's response was? She's like, "No, I don't miss those days." Because when they were young, every time we traveled anywhere, Grace had to carry the diaper bags, and then we had to always worry about what they're gonna eat and where they are, and always have to maybe she had it harder than I did. She's the one that worried about everything. I'm the one that just played with them. And so Grace said, "No, I don't want to have children." She's glad that the kids are the boys are grown now and they can take care of themselves. Sarah, she's already given up. At 89 years old, she's like, "I'm 89 years old. I'm already past the time, of course." And so she laughs at that. Well, we know the story that when Isaac is born, the name Isaac means after that incident. So those are the two stories that we commonly know about Sarah. Now let me tell you about two uncommon stories about Sarah. One of them is a story about human trafficking. In Genesis chapter 12, and it happens twice. It takes them a couple of times to learn this lesson. In Genesis chapter 12, at that time, Sarai and Abram, they go down to Egypt. And as they are down in Egypt, they meet the Pharaoh. And so Sarah, her name being princess, she must have been very beautiful. But as they meet the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh comes up to them, Abraham, instead of introducing Sarah as his wife, guess what do you think he introduced her as? What's the other relationship?
Sister.
Sister. And he did so because, and it says in scripture that he didn't want, he was afraid that because she was beautiful, that the Egyptians might attack him, remove him in order to have Sarah. And so in order to save his own life, he introduces her as his sister. Now, what does that mean? Just because he's sister doesn't mean that if the Pharaoh or the Egyptians wanted her, it's not that he's protecting her, saying, "No, she's my wife." He's basically saying, "Well, if they want her, go right ahead." So it's one of those stories of, in a way, it's human trafficking, right? Abraham is willing to just allow Sarah to be taken. And what happens in the story in Genesis chapter 12 is that that's exactly what happens. The Pharaoh courts Abram and Sarai, and then seeing Sarai and being introduced as Abraham's sister instead of his wife, invites her in and wants to take her as his wife. And at that time, what happens is that God intervenes. According to the story, God intervenes and strikes the Pharaoh with illness. And it's only through that illness that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians realize that she's already a married person. This incident happens actually twice. In chapter 20, they go to another region of that area called Greer, and that second incident, Sarah's the one that introduces the people of that region as Abraham as being her brother. And the same thing happens. The men there tries to court her, and then God intervenes and says, and afflicts the men there with illness for trying to take Sarah from Abraham. And you have to kind of wonder, what's with this, right? It's one of those very unusual stories that's in the Bible of Sarah and Abraham, where they represent the patriarch and the matriarch of our Judeo-Christian heritage, right? They are our faith father and mother. And yet you have the story of them going from place to place, using each other as brother and sister because they don't want to get in behind. Imagine, hearing these stories of your own parents. Right? These are our faith forefathers, Abraham and Sarah. And yet this is the stories that we have of them. In a way, it kind of shows to us the humanity of Sarah and Abraham, how they struggle with trusting and how they've struggled with their faith as well. And again, the fact that it happens twice, right? It's not just once, but twice, kind of makes us ponder about, or makes us realize, sure, there are lessons that we learn in life where it doesn't take one time, or even sometimes two times. It takes a while for us to learn. Continuing on, so the other story that we know about Abraham and Sarah is, of course, in Genesis 21, and going back to the story now of the promise of Abraham and Sarah conceiving a child and having Ishmael, or having Isaac. So going back to the situation with Hagar. After Hagar conceives a child, Hagar, Sarah's servant. Remember, Sarah was 85 years old at that time. So when Ishmael is born, Sarah was about 85. And then by the time she conceives and has a child, she's 90. She's 75. By the time she conceives, she's 90 years old. So that means that Ishmael had already grown up, from 75 to 90. What is it, 15 years old? And so there's a gap here. And during that time, all throughout that time, Sarah had contempt for Hagar. And even though it was her plan that Hagar conceive a child and have this son, Ishmael, that she never accepted Ishmael as his own son. So in Genesis 21, or Genesis 20, after Sarah conceives Isaac and has a son, Isaac is born. In Genesis 21, the story of how Sarah sees Ishmael, who would have been about 15 years old, playing with Isaac, or by that time, a couple years afterwards, by the time Isaac is weaned, so maybe he's about 2 or somewhere between 2 to 5 years old, that means Ishmael is somewhere between 17 to 20 years old. Ishmael is playing with Isaac, and Sarah's reaction to that is, you know what? We need to get rid of Isaac. We got to get rid of Ishmael, because if Ishmael continues to be the son of Abraham, that means that when Abraham passes, the inheritance would go on to Ishmael. And so she goes up to Abraham and tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. And Abraham, again,
Albert, we're getting a lot of, it's either, I don't know if it's feedback or somebody needs to be muted.
if everyone else can mute, it would help, I think.
Peggy, I think Bill said that he thought Nancy might be listening in the hospital and possibly the nurses don't know how to turn on the mute.
Oh, thank you for clarifying that, Chris.
That was just Bill's idea.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That would certainly be okay.
Sorry about that. Next time I'll make sure that I log in through the church account. I can mute people, but I'm sorry, I don't have that control.
That's okay. We want to accommodate everybody.
Sure, yeah. And as I'm talking about Sarah, trying to take matters in their own hands and trying to control the situation, I have no control. I have no control over the news right now. So anyhow, going back to the story of Abraham and Sarah, Sarah goes over to Abraham and says, send her away. I don't want her anymore. Send her and Ishmael away from their home. And so in chapter 20, it says the child grew, that's Isaac, and was weaned, so he's about 2 to 5 years old. And Abraham made a great feast at the day of Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave girl and her son, for the son of this slave girl shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham. Thank goodness that Abraham actually had some conscience on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave girl, slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that the offspring will be named to you. And so Abraham just says, okay. He goes over, packs a basket of food, a jug of water, gives it to Hagar, sends Hagar and Ishmael away. As they do this, you can imagine. You see this picture that you have right there? It kind of has this image of Abraham just kind of blessing them on their way, right? But you all know they're in the middle of a desert, right? They're in the middle of a desert, and for Hagar to go, and again, a lot of the pictures that depict this story has Ishmael being just a little boy. He's actually a little older, about 15, or a little older. They get sent out into the wilderness by themselves, and a basket of food isn't going to last them at all. And it is, of course, in the story that as they go out into the wilderness, they run out of food, and Hagar sits under a tree and basically weeps over her son Ishmael, because they know that there's no way for them to survive. And she takes it within herself to just kind of accept the fact that they're going to die out in the wilderness. So can you imagine the type of anguish, right, and the pain that Hagar has gone through? And if it wasn't for, according to the story, that God intervenes, according to the story, an angel of the Lord comes down, brings food and provides food for Hagar and Ishmael, and then promises them that they will themselves be the ancestors of a great nation, which we attribute now to being the the people of the Middle East, if it wasn't for that intervention, surely Hagar and Ishmael would have perished. That was all because of Sarah, of her contempt, because of her jealousy, because of her reaction of she tried to take matters into her own hands, kind of created the situation, had Hagar conceive a child, have a son, and then not want them anymore. And it kind of gives this true picture of even our matriarch of our faith was very much human, made them pretty tough decisions. I don't know if bad decisions. Let me just put it that way. Unfortunate decisions. But, she also, Sarah, had an interesting, she also had a very tough time. We all know another problematic story that follows after that incident is that once Isaac grew to, and the Bible doesn't tell us, we don't know the exact timeline, but we assume that Isaac must have been about 10 or so, or perhaps somewhere between 10 and 15, that Abraham receives this mandate from God. And it's one of the problematic, I call this one of the problematic stories in the Bible. Every year, it's part of the lectionary reading during the summer. And every year I try to avoid this story. Do you guys know which story I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
This is the story of Genesis chapter 22. And it's a story where God puts Abraham, it's about the testing of Abraham's faith. And so what Genesis 22, what that says is that God comes before Abraham and says, I want to know if you are truly faithful, if you're truly going to be my servant, if you're truly going to be my chosen one, to be the father of all the nations, then I need you to be faithful. And the test that God gives to Abraham is to sacrifice the thing that is most important to him. And at that time, of course, and I don't know if, what parent would not say that the most important thing in any of our lives is our children, right? And for Abraham, he now only has one child, Isaac, and the test is for him to sacrifice Isaac. So then, you all know the story, right? And the picture shows it. Abraham takes Isaac on a journey. He says, let's go camping, and goes up the mountain, up Mount Moriah. And he even makes Isaac carry his own sticks, right? So Isaac is carrying his own sticks, he's carrying his own knife, and Abraham is just following along. On the way up, Isaac even asks Abraham, Father, where's the sacrifice? We have the wood, we have the, we have all the material to make a great campfire here, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's response to that is, God will provide. They go up the mountain, and when they get to the top, they, and I don't know what Abraham said to Isaac. He says to Isaac, yeah, well, why don't you just kind of lay down here on top of the altar, right? And then Abraham takes the flint knife and raises it up and is ready to go and sacrifice his own son. And at that point, the angel of the Lord calls out to Abraham saying, Abraham, Abraham, do not touch that child, for he is my son. And so then stops him from killing Isaac. So that's the biblical story that is often told, and that is used as an example of Abraham's faithfulness. Now, I don't know about you, but do you like that story?
No,
Is that a good story?
no.
I've always had a problem with that story. I mean, well, first of all, I've always said, what kind of a God would ever ask us to sacrifice anyone else, if let alone our own child, right? And of course, the story is used as a way of kind of mirroring the theology or the story of God being willing to sacrifice his own son, Jesus Christ, on the cross. I have a problem with that too. It is our Christian theology, and yet we have to address how challenging that theology is, right? That God would sacrifice his own son because he loves us so much. Well, I always say, if God loves us so much, then God should love his own son just as much, if not more, right? And so it's hard to have that theology of God sacrificing his son, and in the same way, asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And we, covered this in the last when we did the last week of Jesus Christ study. That the way to understand that concept is not that God sacrificed his son Jesus Christ, because that's what that's in seminary we call that the divine child abuse. If God sacrificed his own son, that's child abuse. And for God to do that, that's what we would call God's, the divine child abuse. So instead of thinking of it that way, we have to understand that it had to be, if Jesus died on the cross or willingly went to the cross, it was Jesus's decision to willingly sacrifice himself. It cannot be God sacrificing his own son. And so here you have the whole issue with, well, if God and Jesus is the same and we have the Trinity and nobody can ever figure out how that works. But the whole theology of a father sacrificing a son is problematic. And here we do have the story of Abraham being called to sacrifice Isaac. And again, even though this story is used to show Abraham's faithfulness, I always ask the question of, where's Sarah in this story? So imagine if you were Sarah. Imagine if you are Sarah when Abraham tells you, honey, I need to go on this camping trip with our only son, Isaac, because God told me to sacrifice him. What mother would let her husband go do that? No one, right?
No.
The whole chapter doesn't say anything about Sarah. Interesting. What's more interesting is that after the incident with Abraham attempting to sacrifice Isaac and get stopped by God or the messenger, and then it says at the end of that chapter, so Abraham returned from the mountain and lived in the land of Beersheba for many years. It doesn't say Abraham and Isaac returned. It says only Abraham returned. And the story of Isaac isn't told for many chapters, like 6 chapters, until it comes time for Isaac to get married. It's almost as if the story of Isaac just kind of get dropped off. It's almost as if I was Isaac, I would have been traumatized from that incident and just kind of needed a time away for a while. But what's interesting is that the very next chapter after the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, it tells about Sarah's death. The story of Sarah's death immediately follows the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. It's almost as if that incident created some sort of a barrier or a challenge or a rift in their relationship. And even though it says that Sarah lived to for many years to an old age, we don't really know the timeline of how old Isaac was when that incident happened, but it could be where immediately after that incident, it broke Sarah's heart, and Sarah ended up passing. It's interesting the way the story kind of lines up, because what we get from all this is the challenge, the struggle that that Sarah had throughout her life. She lived in a way that was, again, back in 4,000 years ago, in that type of society. A woman's role was defined by the husband, and it was also defined by the child, usually a male child, so the son, which also meant why Sarah wanted so badly for Abraham to have a child, because if Abraham were to have passed at any time, although Abraham lived much longer than Sarah, a woman's security would always be through the children. And so that could be the reason why Sarah wanted Abraham to have a child. And since she was already past that child-rearing age, that she forced that situation to have her servant bear a child for them. But all throughout Sarah's life, she really struggled. She supported Abraham as much as possible. She even went along with Abraham in saying, I'm his sister, with a very high possibility that she would have been trafficked in Egypt. She goes along with Abraham. And even though in her latter years, she kind of forced her way into having Abraham have a child, Ishmael. But then when that wasn't to her liking, sending Ishmael and Hagar off and finally having Isaac, and then having the situation, the story of her husband, Abraham, sacrificing her only child, she dies immediately afterwards. It's just you have to reflect upon the struggle and the hard life that she had. So as we kind of look at, that's the life, that's the story of Sarah. What are the key takeaways that we get from Sarah's life? What are the lessons to learn from her? We definitely have we definitely see in her life, that how hard it is to trust when God came and gave that promise, that covenant. It wasn't just to Abraham, it was both to Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai at the time. That covenant was given to both of them. And yet the challenge is to just hear that promise and then just stay faithful all those years. And definitely there's a lesson of patience in allowing God's timing, that when she tries to force it, it doesn't work out for her. There is definitely a lesson about just the relational dynamics. And even though we have this depiction of, Abraham and Sarah are our patriarch and matriarch of our Jewish and Christian faith, they had their struggles. It was hard. So I want to hear from you. So if you have muted yourself, you can unmute now, or what are your thoughts of Sarah?
Sarah wasn't willing to wait for God's will. She wanted to impose her own will.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was struck by how much the culture and the time in which they lived determined their lives, almost irregardless of God's covenants or promises.
That's right. So because of that culture, and again, I know one of the things that's on the news now, if any of you are like me and glued to the news sometimes, the news feed on my phone, the big news that's flowing in is this whole possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned. And that's going to have a huge impact.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding women's rights.
Mm-hmm.
And again, What year is this? 2022? 21st century. And we still have these issues of the dynamics and the culture of what is the value of a woman. And so definitely for Sarah.
Value of a child.
What was that?
Also, what is the value of an unborn child?
And the value of an unborn child.
Rights do they have?
That's true. Yeah, exactly. And so here you do have that the story of even before Isaac was born, when Ishmael was born, you know, the value of Ishmael, you know, for Abraham and Sarah to just say, well, you know what, now that we have Isaac, we don't need you anymore, and to just send them off.
Right.
There's an interesting side story there, Albert. In the Quran, Hagar and Ishmael are sent to the desert, and God provides them a well. And then Abraham goes and he founds the Kaaba, which is the centerpiece of the great mosque in Mecca. So, and Ishmael becomes an Islamic hero.
Right. Exactly. So that's the promise that comes out, and therefore he becomes the patriarch of the Islamic faith.
Right.
Islamic people. Yeah. So that is that what I see from there is how it's the story of redemption, that we make bad choices all the time. But no matter what, God has a way of always bringing about redemption. And so and it's not just make light that, oh yeah, then we can go and make mistakes all the time and live horribly. No. But even in the midst of our failures or our bad decisions or our poor decisions, there is a newness or hope, a redemption that always comes about. And so for the story of Ishmael is the fact that through that incident with being sent away by Sarah, Abraham and Sarah, that Ishmael is redeemed and is given this new a whole branch of faith.
God atoned for that sin, and sometimes impatience leads to sin, and God's atonement for it in the case of Hagar and Ishmael and Abraham.
That's right.
Take Hagar.
There is that. It's definitely a story of atonement.
Mm-hmm.
I often think of grace as a New Testament concept. But it would seem as if there was some form of grace for that family,
Mm-hmm.
even though it wasn't spelled out as grace. Or do I have my timeline really badly messed up?
No, I think grace has always existed in the concept, or it may be a theological concept that as we as Christians attribute to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. However, the attribute of grace has always been part of the divine storyline through the Old and New Testament. And so again, I always say the stories that we read in the Old Testament, you have to read it through the lens of the people that are writing the story, right? I'm a very I want to make it very clear that, you know, our understanding of scripture is that it didn't fall out of the sky, right? It was written by people of faith trying to write down, it's their testimony. That's what we call it, testament, right? Old Testament, New Testament. It's called a testament. It's a testimony of how they understood who God was and what God was doing in their life at that time, or a story that they were writing about. It's their testimony. However, as we all know about our own understanding and our testimonies or our own faith, is that we are continuously learning and growing. And at different times early on, we have a certain way of thinking our theology that can get challenged and grow over time. And so there are certain ways that the stories are told. And one of the clear examples of that is when you hear the stories of in the Old Testament, like in the book of Joshua or Judges, where the Israelites were called and they conquered all these people, and it was God's blessing upon them that they kill all the people of that region. We read that from the 21st century and think, well, that doesn't sound like what God would do. But the people back then, that's how they understood divine providence. And so we just have to understand that. It's not to say that that's what God did. It's how they understood it.
Actually, Albert, I read a rabbinic commentary on the sacrifice of Isaac, and this commentary said that because that was the practice at the time, that Abraham actually thought that's what would prove his faith. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when he goes to do that, God says no. So it wasn't God who was speaking to Abraham initially. It was initially Abraham's concept of faithfulness that is then turned around when he actually goes to attempt it. And the moral of that story is, if God ever asks you to sacrifice your children, you know it's not God. That was a rabbinic commentary.
That's a great, thank you, Bill, for sharing that, because that does make sense. Yes, and that is exactly right. That because the way people are acting, they are acting in ways what they think constitutes God's will or God's command. And so in this story, you're right. Abraham thought that the sacrifice of his son was the means to show faithfulness, because that was a common practice back then with all the other pagan practices, that was a common practice, that was what he would have done. But you're right. And God's response is, no, that's not it.
Isn't that what we say in the Lord's Prayer? Let thy will be done. And are we willing to live that, to let God's will be done? Or are we imposing our will upon what we think is God's will?
Mm-hmm. And that is always the challenge in life, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Every day trying to figure out, what is God's will?
Right.
And what is my desire that sometimes screams louder than listening to God?
That's right. Yeah.
And that's
the only way that I try to discern what is God's will is by thinking about the life of Jesus and say, well, what would Jesus do? Is this a kind thing to do? Is this generous? Is this compassionate?
Right.
And that's the challenges that I try to put to myself.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
amen.
Yeah.
WWJD, what would Jesus do? I used to have a bracelet. That used to be one of the
Yep.
that used to be one of the promotions, or the what do you call that? There was a movement
Mm-hmm.
to get everyone to say that and think that way, which I think we should all try to do that still.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I was trying to show this little saying that lives on my refrigerator, but it shows up in a mirror image. So it says, God's will is for everyone to have a joyful life of love and devotion.
Amen.
Sounds good.
Amen.
I think also, Albert, when I think of Sarah's story, I think to be owned by a man is very difficult for us women today who had to move through becoming independent. And it's sad that there's always someone holding women accountable. And of course, when you move into slavery and things like that. So, and I agree with Peggy, it's, love thy neighbor as thyself doesn't mean ownership. So, yeah, I think it's sort of sad that I feel like she was more of a victim and then died early because of her, the trauma she had to go through.
That's my takeaway as well. It's disturbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
like,
also-
where's poor Sarah in all this? That was disturbing to me.
I agree, Penny.
And I think go ahead.
I'm also touched by the story not only, but because in our family, we have a granddaughter who's left her marriage. She's left her marriage because of a husband and a husband's family who's wanting to treat her the way the women were treated back in those days. And it reminds me that is still going on in this, in this country. The man is in charge. You do everything the way the man wants. And of course, we see that politically, as you talked about earlier, and men don't seem to be held accountable the way women are. They have more freedom than women do. It just kind of brought all that back and threw it in my face.
Yeah.
And of
Huge
course,
social issue.
Yeah, and it's with us. It's still with us. We have had
Yeah.
all these years. We haven't come as far as we think we and hope that we have.
In that vein, Nancy, as we have some more opportunities now than Sarah had in a totally different setting, it really becomes incumbent upon us to search carefully for what kind of freedom or what kind of privilege or what kind of power we want to have. The power or the right to make a decision has great consequences, not just for us, but the world that we're in. And I think it's very, it's all almost burdensome to think about the power that our decisions could have.
Going over to Dawn Freely's to sign our Teal Field tax returns.
Sorry, guys.
I
I'm
think
just glad I'm not Sarah. I'd have a hard time.
I think the challenge for women of our day, and from the 60s onward, is when you're married, of course, you look back at your own parents. And at least in my case, my father definitely was the decision maker. My mother was the person that went along and cared for the children. And then when Bill and I married, it was like, look, no, we both have to do the housework here. We both are in charge here. We both make the decisions. And of course, it's a conflict because you're learning new ways. But I suppose the lessons of Sarah saying it takes patience and time to be able to work that relationship through is a good lesson.
Yeah, I think males of my generation were sometimes caught in the middle. We had mothers that were very different than our wives. And so that psychologically speaking, there was tension there because you had the model of your mother and then you had your wife, and how do you negotiate the two? Not easy.
Carefully.
Right. Especially in group discussions, carefully.
When you think about Abraham taking it upon himself, thinking that God has asked him to kill their son, it would be traumatic if my husband took one of my boys and took him out to kill him. It's just a story that's very disturbing. There's lots of ways we could go on this discussion, but we don't have enough time. But I do, we need as women to be responsible for our own decisions and our relationship to God and be independent of males, because we walk our own path. And so for me, this story, and yet when you put it into context, I think it's, we have to realize that this is years ago and how they did things. So I'm just glad we've made some movement forward.
But Carol, maybe an equivalent would be taking your son off to war, which is, that you're being asked to sacrifice your son. For often wars are, at least historically, been generated by male aggressiveness. And so that might be a way of putting that females still have to deal with that.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
But the norms of today, it's women are going off too. So it's kind of a change in the historical perspective.
Going back to what Carol was saying, there is definitely a historical context, but you're right. Everyone, men and women, we all have to individually take responsibility for our growth and our actions. And sure, in culture, there are roles that culture kind of defines within that culture. However, in the end, it is going to come down to, well, how do I live out my understanding of faith and God's calling upon myself? That is, in a way, goes down back to what does it mean to be faithful? And we can definitely see in the story that, as Bill said, yeah, sometimes our understanding of faithfulness, what Abraham thought was faithfulness, it's not quite faithfulness. It requires us to really think about and question what is faith and what is faithfulness. And then ultimately, it comes back down to, I always say, if I ever have a question if one decision is right or not, is it my decision or is it God's will? I always go back to Jesus's great commandment. Is it loving God? Is it loving your neighbor?
Absolutely.
Sometimes you just need something simple to base it upon. Yeah. We can try to base it on commandment number 7 or commandment, it gets really complicated. We just need to come back and say, okay, how is this loving God and God's creation? How is this loving my neighbors? If we can adhere to that, I'm like, well, at least I think it's in the right direction.
I was thinking of another takeaway from the story of Sarah. And in fact, Ishmael was a stepson. And I know that it's very difficult for blended families these days for people to accept the children of, the spouse that they marry. And yet, I think the takeaway from Sarah is, let's not abandon those children. Let's treat them as a child of God and welcome them into the family and care for them as much as maybe our own birth children.
Right. Well, everyone, thank you for our time together. And next week, we're going to be looking at, oh, well, you know what? I should have. I didn't realize that I still had the screen share going on.
There we go.
Oh, there you are. So next time, we're going to be looking at the story of Tamar. And so and Tamar is a lesser known character, and each of these characters that we look at, especially the lesser known ones.
I know, because we don't put the screen up.
The lesser known ones, there's going to be tough lessons of the culture at that time and how oppressive it is. And it's a way for us to kind of look through that culture to see how these women were able to take their ownership and take their responsibility and challenge some of the oppressive culture at that time. So, all right, everyone. Thank you,
Albert.
Thank
you.
you. Great.
Go for a
Thank
prayer
you.
and we'll close us out. Okay. Gracious God, we truly give you thanks for this time, and we pray that your blessing go with us and be upon all of us wherever we are, and that may we continue as we do our studies and read these stories and reflect on these stories, common or not, that they may be a guide in how we live and make our choices in our lives. Be with us, and may your grace and may your grace always be our guide in our in everyday life. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.